Cześć, jestem Michał Gąszczyk.
A ja Olga Żółkiewicz, a wy słuchacie praktycznego podcastu o EB i rekrutacji IT,
w którym poznacie tajniki pracy ekspertów z branży.
Hi everyone and welcome to our podcast. Today is a very special episode because as you hear and see, but no, you rather hear it, it's not a Polish episode. So you can practice very good English actually because we are having guests straight from the US. And I would like to welcome here David Moore, who is a vice president in recruitment in Box, and Katrina Giorgio, who is head of global tech recruiting.
Hey.
Hi guys.
Hi,
Hello.
how's it going?
And we will be talking today about Polish market, but from the other point of view. So normally we are very having some inside thoughts about how is from the Polish point of view work in Poland, in Polish IT. And today we will ask our guests how they see the market, the changes between US and other countries, actually, because you will probably tell us soon that it's not only US and Poland about how to work here. So let's go straight to the point. What is Box? Like a long story short.
So for the people who don't know you, what is the company doing and a little bit of, history?
Yeah. So Box is a technology company. It has been around since 2005. It was founded by a couple of friends, so a very sort of typical kind of tech startup story. But two of the three founders are still in the company, which I thought was pretty cool. That was one of the reasons why I wanted to come to the company. One is the CEO, and one is the CFO.
They still like it.
They still, they still like it. So, and I think it's again, it's like the best of both worlds because you still have the founders, so it still feels a little bit like a startup company. But actually now we're quite a mature company. We've been around more than 15 years. We're a public company. So
some huge evaluation, yeah, in billions of dollars.
Yeah, billions of dollars. Yeah, but relatively small. So so definitely not the same size as say Facebook or Google or Apple.
So can you share some numbers, like how many people do you employ?
Yeah,
or?
Globally, we're about 2,500 people.
Okay.
And so in terms of what is it, it's a cloud company, cloud content management company. So we're mainly focusing on working with businesses. We help businesses who basically need to share and protect their files. So we create like a cloud ecosystem. And obviously for many businesses, life has become more complicated in recent years. Now they have many more employees who are working in offices, but also working remotely. And so they have to figure out, okay, how can we share our files in a safe and secure way? So Box provides a very safe and secure platform where you can store your content, you can share your content, and we're trying to add more and more sort of value-added services all the time. So one example, we just launched an e-signature product. So as well as sharing and sending documents around inside the company. Now you can actually do things. You can send a document. I can send a document to you. You can do an e-signature, send it back to me, and we can make the company drive the business that way. So yeah, it's pretty cool.
So in terms of your roles in the company, so what exactly are you responsible for?
Well, so Katrina and I work together. Basically, we do, they call it talent acquisition. So this means basically...
acquiring talent.
Yeah, exactly.
Thank you, Michael.
Yeah. How we bring talent into the company. But it's my job is amazing because it's really everything from the very, most senior positions all the way down to the people that are just joining us from college and university, and then everything in between. So... and it's also all parts of the company. So yeah, today we're talking mainly about the technical side and engineering, which is what, and I'll let Katrina talk about that. But then also we hire for the rest of the business. So, the roles like us in the HR department or the finance department, and also all of the people that are helping to sell the product. So sales, marketing, etc. But yeah, do you want to talk more about what you do?
Yeah, and I lead the global tech recruiting organization. So at Box, we organize ourselves in three primary organizations: build, reach, and enable. So build is everything product development. So design, product management, engineering, operations, operations, site reliability, things like that. Then we also have reach, which is go to market, and enable, which is kind of the business functions that support and enable the business. And it's been really fun for me as well. Since joining, we had really most of our engineers in the Silicon Valley area. And over the course of the last 2.5, 3 years, we've expanded, globally, primarily into Poland, which has been a really fun experience to learn all about this market, differences, nuances, things like that. And then also into the Amsterdam market as well. So expanding our engineering and product management footprint has been a really exciting experience.
So as you said, like 2.5, 3 years you did that. So you made the decision to expand to Poland then. So it was exactly where COVID was, wasn't it?
Yeah.
So basically, can you talk us through the process or take us through the process of why exactly have you chosen Poland?
This was my question. I was
Because there's so many locations in the world. Obviously, there are cheaper ones and there are more expensive ones. So what drove you actually to Poland? So what was the decision-making process in general?
Well, I mean, I guess to start at the beginning, it's pretty common for technology companies when they want to expand globally to start thinking about, okay, where we need, we can't rely just on one location. We want to expand and find good pockets of engineering talent in other locations. And so over the years, many companies have done this in places like India or China or South America. So we started from this basic idea, right? That we wanted to continue to grow the company. And we knew that, competing for talent against much bigger technology companies in Silicon Valley is really hard.
It's like crazy competitive.
This makes our job really, really tough.
Yeah.
And the engineering team also understood this. And so we said, okay, so where do we go? And, again, it was a partnership with our team, but also driven a lot by the engineering team themselves.
Really?
They were like, okay, we need to figure out which is the best location where we can find, where we can have access to a lot of good quality engineers. Obviously, we're a US company, so the ability to communicate well in English was also an important factor. And then you look at sort of geopolitical factors like, is the country safe? Is it stable? And so, they did a big analysis. We started looking all over the world, and then after some time, they decided to focus on Eastern Europe. And
was there any short list at the end?
Yeah, so I think some of the interesting factors from a talent standpoint, as David was mentioning, this concept of talent intelligence or talent density, how when we look at our tech stack, right?
Yeah.
Where country might have a lot of engineers, but are they the engineers that we're looking to hire? So we took a look at our tech stack, the population of talent that's currently in the market, and then also looking kind of forward projections, how much of this talent is coming out of universities, right? So this was a really big benefit for Poland. There's a lot of engineers and developers that were focusing on the type of technologies that we use at Box. And then similarly, because we're based in Silicon Valley area, we also thought the follow the sun model would be a really helpful advantage for us. So making sure that the time zone had enough overlap that they would allow for collaboration and communication across teams that are based in multiple locations, but also have kind of that natural 24-hour coverage throughout the days, especially for things like site reliability, and making sure that the site is stable as we have very global customers across the world.
Okay, that makes sense.
So you are already here for quite a time, and can you share with us your thoughts on Polish market? What are the advantages, disadvantages,
differences?
Well, we kind of wanted to tell the story about how we started because, like you said, Michael, we the team, the engineering team said, "Oh, we're going to Poland. Figure it out." And so normally. In all my career, if somebody gives me a challenge like this in a new country that I don't know, my first thing is I get on a plane, I go to the country, and I check it out. Right? I meet the people. I try to get a feeling for how are candidates in this market. What is the good thing, the bad thing, all this kind of stuff. And because it was COVID, we couldn't do that. So it was kind of first of all, we were a little scared, and then we started to okay, how can we figure this out? And So I started talking to people that I know in my network who maybe have worked in companies that have had an office in Poland. We literally we sent out an email to our whole company and said, do we have any Polish employees? Do we have any employees that have worked with Polish people? And we were having just one-on-ones with them, saying, okay, tell us about the Polish market. So it was like a little jigsaw puzzle. We were finding out little facts, and we were putting it all together.
We would even like Google hiring in Poland, and we found someone who teaches sourcing and recruiting, and we reached out to her on LinkedIn to have a conversation with her as well. So we really just tried to reach out.
Kasia?
Yes.
Reach out and chat with folks that would be open to talking and sharing knowledge with us. Because we didn't want to come in completely blind. We wanted to try to understand what are the nuances, things that work in the US, you can't just pick them up and translate them into the Poland market. You have to be sensitive to those things. And then, of course, as we started to learn more, we realized we needed to find a really strong leader for our recruiting team in the Poland office. And so we added Yannick to our team, and he really has helped us build this strategy that's Poland specific and translate what we have for the US to fit and do really well in the Poland market too. So built the team around that. And
yeah, but when we had some of those first conversations, again, some people were saying, "Oh, this is difficult. It's difficult." And so we were getting a little scared because they were like, "Oh, it's difficult to do this from nothing, right? There's a lot of big companies already here, and nobody knows your company." So, we had to think about a lot of things, and we knew, again, we have our engineers are fantastic. We always focus on good quality talent. So the hiring process for Box is quite complicated, and it's and so we had to think, okay, our first target was to hire 25 people, by January 2021, and now this seems like a tiny number, but for us it was like 25 people, because then we were thinking about the hiring process, and in order to hire 25 people, that means
how many people you have to put to the pipeline?
You have to put into the very top of the funnel, and it was basically about 5,000 people, right?
Yeah, because we were using new market pass-through rates, right? It's very different when we're looking at what our pass-through rates are in a market that's very mature and we know very well, versus a completely new market where no one really knows.
No brand awareness at all. Yeah.
And the other bit of it was our recruiters were US-based recruiters hiring for Poland. So then you add kind of the time zone overlap and trying to sell and understand how we can kind of communicate best with the Polish market from the US, from Zoom. So it was definitely a experience where we learned so much, and has been very fun. As
it was a greenfield project, wasn't it?
Completely.
Yeah, this was like our big COVID adventure.
Yeah. And have you been sure from the very beginning that you actually want to open a site in Poland? Because we know that you have an office in Poland for quite a while. So have you ever considered like not having a site, but just to hire people remotely? Like in COVID times, it was like very popular in Poland to work from home, or even obligatory. So was this decision about opening an office like a firm decision from the very beginning, or is this like something you just grew up to?
Yeah, well, so this is a really interesting point, and I think obviously now a lot of things have been changing in the last couple of years, but I think we did make a decision. We wanted to open an office. Why? Because I think Box, one of the reasons why many of us love working for Box is the company has an amazing culture. And I think 2 years ago, most of our engineers were based in our headquarters in California. And one of the reasons why I decided to join Box was when I went to the office and I checked it out, and I'm like, oh, this is really cool. It's a great environment. Everyone was very friendly.
Because you used to work for big companies before.
Yeah. I left one of the biggest companies to join Box, and it was a big decision. But when I went to the office and I felt the environment and met the people, that was what convinced me to join. So having a cool office and having a cool space where people can come together and collaborate and get to know each other and build relationships, this was a big feature of our culture. But then COVID happened. And I remember at one stage in our project, I was joking. I'm like, my God, we must be, the whole world is working at home. And meanwhile, we're trying to fill an office up with engineers. Now, obviously this has changed now. But our philosophy as a company is we still believe, people love to get together and they love to meet each other and build relationships.
So do you do hybrid right now?
Yeah, we do hybrid.
But like both in Poland and US? Or?
Yeah.
And are there any like rules that you have to be a certain time at the office?
Like twice a week or whatever?
No. So, again, to be honest, there are still lots of details that as a company we're figuring out, and we're testing things, and every now and again we survey our employees and we get feedback, and then we make some changes. But no, I mean, as a company, we have no strict rules. We want to offer as much flexibility to our employees as possible, because we know people have learned during COVID that everyone now has very different preferences around how they want to live their life and how they want to manage their work and their life together. So we have some people that maybe it's hard for them to work, and concentrate at home, so they come to the office 5 days a week. A lot of other people come in 1 or 2 days a week, and then some people are working, mostly from home. But
there's no like strict policies, so it's up to them.
Yeah, it's very flexible. It's very flexible. And over the course of the pandemic, what was really interesting for me, because I started in an office, and then as we all went remote, was to see the culture that David was talking about, a really strong, palpable culture that you can feel when you're in the office. It translated to remote. So our employee resource groups started meeting virtually. And it became really cool, because before we had local chapters for each of our employee resource groups. We have Families at Box, parents group, essentially, in Austin, Texas, and a different one in San Francisco. But during the pandemic, because they were all virtual, a lot of these communities actually were able to come together from across a lot of different offices. So it was a different type of way to create connection, which translated online. And there's still virtual book clubs that our Latinx communities and our women in technology communities are doing together online. One just happened yesterday. So it's very, very fun, and at times where people can join from a variety of places. But to David's
so working
point,
remotely actually connected those people, from different locations.
Totally.
Yeah,
Totally.
it was like in different ways.
And how you like do it? So are there any community managers for? Okay, so
Yeah.
you have those people who are responsible
Leads.
to.
Mhm.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, leads for these communities, which is, it's kind of a volunteer basis. But a community, we have these things called leader mindsets at Box. So business mindset, team mindset, self mindset, and community mindset. And so community is one of our 4 main pillars at Box. And so people generally will engage as much as they want to in community-based kind of experiences as we build the culture. But in addition, part of the reason that Box was pretty sure we wanted to have a true office space and culture was because we have a value of becoming an owner and feeling like you're truly part of this company. We're not an outsourced software house, right? We're not looking for people in Poland to build a widget and call it a day. We're looking for people who want to build a product. And so we wanted to create a space where they're able to do that together, separately, and have that flexibility depending on how the teams operate best.
Yeah, actually, that's. So we also talked a lot with our engineering team about, let's think about the kind of jobs we want to offer in Poland, and how are we going to be
Which
competitive.
part of the business, or just producing the software? Yeah.
Yeah, and so when we did, we did some research, and we obviously understood. I mean, there's a lot of different types of companies that have different types of technical presence here, but in many cases, there's a lot of just fairly standard development happening. So we thought, okay, one way we can be competitive and we can differentiate our company inside Poland is we wanted to make sure we offered jobs that reflected the full product lifecycle. So we have a product management team here in Poland, and so Katrina can talk more about this because she's an expert, but we have all of the different jobs. It's not just kind of basic coding. So again, hopefully that means people feel like, okay, Box didn't just outsource development, basic coding to this country.
Well, they're actually part of the
building,
product,
yeah, because we want people to feel like they're part of our business and they're having an impact. They're helping us to grow a global company.
Cool. My next question is, since you're here for quite some time right now, and I have my personal feelings about how different is the market here in Poland versus the market in US. So I can tell you later on my opinion.
No, let's start with your opinion. What's your opinion?
So I believe our market is much easier still, because the only thing you have to do is to have an amazing project to work on, pay above average, and just take care of the people. So since
you make it sound so easy, it's not
because
it
is so easy.
Well, okay.
So my understanding of US market then is that you have a trade-off of how many stock options you will get depending on at which stage you will join the company. So all the people are tied with vesting for 4 years usually, and basically people have their very specific preferences. If I want to join a like 3 people startup or 150 people scale up. So people have preferences on which stage of the company they want to join because of the environment and probably the stock options, etc., etc. So my feeling is that it's harder in US to hire people just because they're tied with vesting and they're just waiting for this huge payday one day, or just to get those options to be released actually. Because and since we don't have so many history of startups doing those payoff days, people in Poland or engineers in Poland in general are not very used to these options packages.
Yeah.
So what they want to get is like a proper salary today.
Mm-hmm.
So that's my feeling. So can you share?
I just want to add one thing. I will agree with David. Taking care of people, Michael, is not easy. And you need to go for an internship in HR department. Welcome.
Yes, okay.
Yeah, but
Well said, Olga,
in
well
terms
said.
of just attracting talent, I think like the whole setup here is easier than in US because the people are just not tied up with vesting. Like majority of them are not.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point. And actually, one of the main differences that we saw when we entered the market is equity or shares of the company is actually a big part of our offering.
Yeah.
And that is because of our value of be an owner, right? We want everyone that joins the company to be a true owner of the company and to feel connected. So our Box employees, no matter which location you are, as a full-time employee, you receive a stock option grant and shares of the company. And this is, as you mentioned, really not a common offering in Poland, or it's a newer offering. And so that is also why we wanted to make, kind of to David's point, the full stack offering for what types of roles we're putting here and people that are really engaged in the long term of the process. The other difference, I think, is there's so many more types of employment options in Poland. You have full-time, you have fixed term, you have B2B, etc.
Everyone loves B2B.
Yes, and it's interesting, right? There's advantages and disadvantages to everything. At Box, we're focused primarily on full-time employment for a couple of reasons. One is for equity. Our full-time employees do get our equity options, which is a huge value upside. And additionally, you get access to the full benefits and also our career development. So Box has a really robust career development program. We have these things called career frameworks. So every level at every organization has a track of what development looks like and developmental guides. And so we have a very consistent kind of growth opportunity.
And you couldn't be doing that for B2B people?
Not in the same way. Because it's a contract that's specific, right, on what the duties will be.
Yeah.
And so it's very dynamic at Box. If there's a really interesting project that needs a ton of work and support on for maybe a product launch for a new product that's being built in Poland, for example, we would need to move some people over and have a different kind of set of work that they would be working on. And so it's a bit different. We do offer B2B for some positions, for certain positions, but we far more value the full-time employment because of the true kind of embedded community that we are working to create in the market.
And isn't that like safer legally, like in theory at least?
For
because
full-time?
This is something we hear from the clients from US that like because I'm working on B2B in my own company since 2012 because it's just very profitable tax-wise.
Yeah.
Basically, that's the only reason actually.
Yep.
And they changed the law recently in Poland and it's even more profitable.
Yep.
But what we are hearing from the clients from the US is that we have some licenses, we have some assurances, some government contracts, whatever, and we just don't want to risk that all for one B2B contract somewhere in Poland because we may end up in some legal battle and we just don't want that and we just want to stick to the contract of employment.
Yeah, we hear similar things, right? There's of course taxation benefits, and that's one of the number one things that we hear. I think it's truly a cultural preference for our company to have kind of a dedicated staff, especially as we're just starting, right? As we're growing and building kind of the first group. We have about 200 Boxers in the Poland office now. And so that's something, it's not like it's something that's set in stone or will never change. But at this point, we've really focused on that because we wanted to make a very kind of cohesive team as we are launching.
Do you find it?
Sorry, I just laughed because you said it's a cultural thing for you guys, and I just thought to myself, it's a cultural thing for
Totally.
Poles not to pay taxes. So I was like, yeah, that's also a cultural thing.
Well, but I think, coming back to what you said at the beginning, I think people make different choices and they have different priorities when they choose where they go to work, right? So some people, obviously money is important and tax is important, and some people prioritize this, and maybe that's why many people find it convenient to work on B2B. But then there's a lot of other reasons why people decide to take a job, right? They like working on the particular product or the type of work they're doing, or
The environment.
the environment or the culture, and they want to be part of something that's bigger. And so
I remember talking to Yannick, how happy he was, like, man, the culture is amazing. Everyone is, fun. And
we pay him,
I know.
$5 to say nice things.
Yeah, but he used to be saying that, like, just after he joined. So even before we had an idea to invite you guys. So actually, that was something that he told me, like from the very beginning, that that's the culture is like really a thing.
Well, and so again, I think there are some things that you said before that I agree with, right? I mean, there's no question trying to compete for talent in the US is tough. But again, there are some people that are not interested in Box because they only want to work for a very early stage startup company.
Yeah.
Some companies want to work for, some people want to work for the very biggest tech companies because they find more stability with this, So in recruiting, we're always thinking about, okay, well, what are we offering, and how do we tell people about this? How do we tell our story? And we know that not everybody is gonna, because of the choices we've made.
It's not a good fit for everyone.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and so we were very clear. We wanted to kind of replicate almost like a second headquarters for Box in Poland, and therefore we wanted to offer an office so people had a nice environment where they can come together. We wanted to make sure we were focusing on. We wanted to hire people that wanted to buy into our vision, basically, and they want to come to Box for the long term, not just for 6 months or 8 months. So yeah, this is what we tried to do.
And do you have the candidates who are working in other companies on B2B contract and they change for a permanent contract just to work for you?
Yes. I mean, actually, when we were initially doing our math, about how many people do we need to talk to, I mean, we were like, oh, wow, there's a lot of people in Poland that are working.
That's a big number.
And we thought, okay, well, so, I mean, and actually, we made the assumption that most of these people will just say no to us, right? But actually what we found is that when we told our story and we said, hey, this is what we can offer, and these are the products you get to work on, and this is the culture we have, and many people actually chose to leave B2B contracts to join Box. So that was pretty cool.
The crazy thing that we were just looking at recently is we're now, for software development, the 5th largest employer in Warsaw. For software development.
I don't know how we did that.
Which is crazy. Yeah, it feels so nuts because, it's just a couple of years ago that we decided to come.
25 people, yeah.
Yeah, right. And now we're 200 plus and 100 plus open roles, and, we're just continuing to grow. So it's very interesting. And of course, the market is always dynamic. It's always changing. People will always have their own set of perspectives and priorities. And so we will evolve, as all companies do, to fit the needs of the business and the needs of the people.
Yeah, I think like after you started here, like Afir came to Warsaw, Snowflake came to Warsaw, and actually Dropbox is actually coming to Warsaw as well.
That's right. Yeah. Well, and so, but again, so like you said at the beginning, if you have an attitude where it's like, oh, we just need to pay people a little bit more and take care of them and everything will be fine. I mean, this is short-term thinking, right?
Because there's always someone else paying even more.
Exactly. And again, there are lots of other places around the world. India maybe is a good example. India used to be seen as an easy place to hire lots of good engineering talent. Then everyone goes, oh yeah, that's a good idea. Everyone goes to India, and then this pushes up wages, and
it's not cheap anymore.
It's not cheap anymore. So then you have to think, okay, well now everyone is here. So now how do we differentiate ourselves, and how do we attract the right talent for our company?
So while we were at costs, like we covered that a little bit, because my understanding, because actually we are doing some salary reports at InHire, and we actually been comparing those to the salaries that are being done in US, in San Francisco, and it shows us right now, like for example, React developer basically costs in US 4 times more than here in Poland.
Mm-hmm.
So is it something that you actually see that the price difference is so big, Obviously, up there you have 50% taxes as well. The other 50% goes to your rent, etc., etc.
Yeah.
But as of you as an employer, basically the cost is as this. So I believe like senior React developer in US should be around 200K a year right now. Where in Poland should be like 50, 60 maybe K. So is it something you can confirm or not? Or no comment?
Well, no, I mean, it's, this is just the reality of the market, right? I mean, I've been lucky in my career that I've been able to hire people all over the world, from Brazil to China and all over the place. So every market has salaries that generally get benchmarked based on the local economy and the cost of living and all this kind of stuff. So, yeah, I mean, there definitely is a difference. And I think it's, to be transparent, and it's pretty obvious that this is why many companies are interested in Poland, because you have great talent. And again, to keep, hiring.
There's great price to value, isn't it?
Yeah.
Like, I mean, people are great. Their English is here. The time zone is kind of here. And it's still cheaper. So, like,
when you think about, I mean, again, I said we're a public company, right? So every quarter we have to tell Wall Street about our results.
Yeah.
And if you think, it's not logical to think, okay, well, we're going to continue hiring all of our engineers into Silicon Valley, which is the most expensive place to hire people in the world. I mean, it doesn't make sense. If you can find really great talent that is a good match for your company in other places in the world, then yeah, I mean, naturally, it makes sense for the recruiting teams of those companies to go searching for this talent. And I think one of the best things about COVID, obviously, there were lots of things about COVID that were really terrible, but I think for us, it ended up being exciting from a talent acquisition perspective, because now many of the most senior leaders in Silicon Valley, who before they believed everybody had to be in one place, now it gives us access to talent in many. So we're hiring engineers in other parts of the US, where before we never used to do that. So I think
the talent pool is completely different.
Yeah, it changes everything. And so for us, that's really exciting.
One of the cool things that we have as well is we have a dedicated compensation team that benchmarks our roles, takes into consideration different market factors on a yearly basis. And so you can see the differences in different markets across the world of what is the percentage that, these salaries or the cost of employing certain talent in certain areas is changing, right? So the rate of change of salary is much higher, for example, in Poland than it is in the US.
Yes.
So that's a huge value, I think, for Polish engineers. As more, companies are coming and the competition gets higher, the demand for talent becomes higher, and the cost for that talent also kind of follows suit. And that's also where the equity piece can really be helpful for us, right? Because that's in US dollars. So you have, two different currencies that your compensation is delivered to you in. And so that creates some sense of security. And also, as we report to Wall Street and, stock changes, that can have a good upside for engineers in Poland as well.
And I think it's like, because we actually got some hate from the internet that we are actually touching the point of costs, because some people were telling us that you shouldn't advertise Poland as a cheaper place, only just focus on quality. But obviously it is cheaper, yeah? But I think that what is worth mentioning, in fact, is that this React developer for 60 or 70K a year in Poland probably has a better life quality than he has in US.
Yeah.
Because you can live in a house somewhere in the suburbs of Warsaw or any other city, or you don't even have to live in the big city. You can afford to have a house and, babysitter and all that stuff. Whereas you probably might not have all those things at the same level, having the bigger salary in US, just because the cost of living are just much higher.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's always economic realities in every country in the world, right? I mean, to be honest, if cost was the only factor, then there are other countries where we could find cheaper people.
Obviously.
And in fact, but the reason why Box and other companies are coming to Poland is because of the quality. Now, probably what will happen, and this happened in other markets as well, is, all of these companies come and this creates big demand and this pushes up wages, and then it becomes, the cost differential becomes narrower. So it's going to change. But again, but we knew when we decided to come to Poland that it was a long-term investment. That's why we focused on building a full-time team, because we want to be here for 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, not like 2 years, and then we go to the next cheapest country. That doesn't make sense for our business or our culture.
But sticking to the quality, because we are talking about the money, and you have the opportunity to let's say it, compare like the quality. And of course, we in Poland say that we are one of the best, and there are studies proving it.
Third in the world. There are studies
Yeah.
saying that Polish
So from
developers
your
are third in the world.
perspective, do you...
So who's number one and number two?
China
US
and Russia.
China and Russia. Oh, damn.
Sorry. Sorry.
Well, it's interesting, right? Because one of the things that I really enjoy about the recruiting team at Box is we're very data driven as an organization. So we measure, we track everything. This helps things like making sure that we have an equitable process. So different groups are passing at the same rate. We don't have kind of any marginalization in our process, but it also allows us to measure how we're doing in different markets and do some predictive analytics on how many people we'll have to put through the pipeline in order to make our hires, right? So when we take a step back and look at the US market versus the Amsterdam market versus the Poland market for build, for example, Poland has some of our highest pass-through rates for our teams, right? So the quality is really quite strong. Amsterdam, on the other hand...
So if you put the same standards to every location,
exactly.
Yeah. And actually, I mean, some of our engineering VPs or engineering directors, maybe they didn't have experience of Poland before we started. And, you know, they knew this decision got taken by the business, but they were a little bit skeptical, right? And so we were able to prove with our metrics that actually, this is a metric that shows the quality is high and we're getting really great people. And so far, all of the feedback we've heard from our US leaders are, wow, we're building really great teams. So we're really happy.
That's great.
We have an annual hackathon, which is a really fun, 24-hour get in a group project, hack whatever, build whatever you want to build. Mainly focus on the R&D teams kind of hacking together products. And actually, a very large portion of our product roadmap comes from ideas that were created by Box engineers and product teams that have come together for this hackathon. And this year, one of the winners of the hackathon was a Tiger team put together in Poland. So it's really fun how they're kind of joining and being part of these cultural experiences that Box puts together.
Yeah, engineers love just working all night. I'm like, wow, it's crazy.
Well, I mean, it's so fun. They're all themed, and so this one was Back to the Future and
Star Trek, right?
Star Trek. Yes. I think Back to the Future was the last one.
So Olga is actually a famous Polish influencer in terms of employer branding. So and she's like very specialist in that field in
Michael
Poland.
is nice to me because I check the time, so he won't speak for too long.
Yeah, but that's true. That's actually true. And I think that my last question would be in terms of employer branding and hiring people from Poland. And do you think, all of you, is it possible to actually hire people in Poland, like tech people in Poland, without actually having a site in Poland? So that, because we were talking about it before, like the Polish developers or engineers are actually want to work for international companies because of obviously the salary differences. And we were just discussing, is it possible to actually build the brand awareness of a company who don't have so much resources to actually open a site in Poland and build like 200 people team in Poland? So do you think this is something that's actually feasible or not?
Well, I mean, I think anything is possible, but I think obviously I would say no because I want the people to come to Box.
Don't come.
But no, I mean, I think it is possible, but it comes back to what we were saying before about, if I'm a candidate and I'm trying to make a decision about my future job, my future career, then you do some analysis, right? And it's like, it's possible for a company to come and offer something, but then if probably the better candidates are going to be thinking very carefully and doing some research, and they're like, okay, is this company stable? Are they going to pay me? And what we're seeing, obviously, in the tech market at the moment, the tech market is crazy, but it goes through these cycles of up and down. Right now, there's a lot of uncertainty in the economy, and there's a lot of startup companies that have had their valuations slashed. And so, again, if you do your research and you're looking at a startup company and it's like, oh, wow, they were worth 500 million, now they're only worth 50 million. Do I really want to sign up to join this company?
And get the stock options for that.
So it is possible, but yeah, I mean, I would always advise people to do their research. I mean, again, I'm saying that partly because we feel right now very strongly that the Box has we're a stable company, we're a public company, our business performance has been very good, and we've got a very clear growth plan in Poland. So hopefully people do their research about us and they go, okay, this is a real company, they have a great culture. So maybe this is a company I should really consider,
I think that now the majority of companies have more or less same offering. Good culture. Okay, we can say this one has better, but from the outside, it's hard to see that. and more or less the same money, more or less the same benefits.
Yeah, there's a pretty good standardization of the
let's
offering
say,
for
of
the
course,
candidates.
there are different ones, but when it comes to like the company that it's not visible, there are some really slight changes between companies. And it will depend on the candidate whether it will be something critical for this or that person. Because if it's a candidate who has 3 offers that are more or less the same,
So
but-
free outsourcing companies, for example.
but for one, you can come to the office and you actually have small kid at your house and you can't focus. Probably that will be the main reason why you choose. It might seem very little, but in this moment, as employers, it's hard to like fulfill all of the needs.
Yeah.
We have to focus. If you're data driven, you know who is your candidate, and you want to know her needs, the group of people you want to attract, and then you fill them. So if your perfect candidate is somebody who wants to come to the office from time to time, probably you won't be looking for people who will be hidden in the basement in their houses, not talking to other people, because that won't be your culture fit.
Yeah.
It won't be. Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, yeah, you're right. I mean, I think this idea that you can't please everybody, right? So you have to think about what you can offer and what are the things that help your company to stand out, and
who are the people that actually like this offering of yours.
Yeah. And again, we think about this a lot in California because we're competing against the most famous companies in the world, and it's really hard. And so we have to think, okay, well, there's no point. We don't have the same marketing budget as Google, for example. So we have to think about how do we. No. I think this is probably too much of a goal. But yeah, I mean, so it's not about spending money. It's about being really creative and thinking about the ways to attract talent to your company. And we have a model we talk about internally where we think about the employee life cycle, and we say, okay, there's hiring, thriving, and belonging. So hiring is the part that Katrina and I are responsible for. We bring the talent in. But then if you bring the talent in and you don't take care of people, then our goal is to help people thrive, right? By thrive, I mean, we want you to have a great time. We want you to have fun. We want you to have a really cool career experience and learn things and develop your career. And then the third part is belonging, which is a really important part of our culture. And we want to attract people from all different backgrounds who can all feel like they belong inside our, they feel comfortable, they feel safe, they feel like they're respected.
So they won't quit. We had one episode when we were speaking about employee experience, and in many companies we tend to invest a lot in talent acquisition,
new people,
hire more, new, and we sometimes forget about people we have on board already, and then they leave, and then we have double as much to recruit. So it's not only about employer branding. It's not only about recruitment marketing. And all this stuff around it, but also about having people happy and with good experience for a long time until they leave, and after. I'm speaking about alumni programs and communities.
Oh yeah,
definitely. And I think we think about how we partner in the market when we think about our employer branding. We're not necessarily putting a billboard on the side of the road that says Box is hiring, but instead we're looking at partnering with different organizations. Like Dare IT, for example, is an organization that we partner with, and looking into other different organizations that will help us bring different perspectives and backgrounds into the company, which will only help us build a more collaborative product. So I think we think about it in a little bit of a different way to make sure that we're putting our energy and efforts into ways that can also showcase our culture. When we first were coming to to Poland, Box was coming to Poland, I participated in the Women in Tech conference, and we put together a workshop on how to advocate for career development, particularly for women in the workplace and technology jobs. So something that's important too, kind of how do you take care of the employees when they're already on board, helping facilitate how to have those conversations with your manager in a productive way, so that you can really focus on career development and growth and thriving and belonging in your role, is also something that we think about when we think about, what does employer branding look like for Box in Poland.
Great. But we're still learning, and we've
always a process.
Only been here for a couple of years, and we're still coming here. Katrina and I were just saying we learned a lot of things just from talking to our team yesterday when we had a meeting, and Yeah, I think Olga, I'm going to call you and ask for your advice on employment
Yeah.
branding, given you're the expert. So yeah,
She's
can
the person
find-
to call.
We
Yeah.
can find each other on LinkedIn.
Cool.
Cool.
I think it's the longest episode ever.
Yes,
Hey.
guys, we wish you all the best.
set the
We
record.
wish you the first place when it comes
biggest
to the
employers
number,
in Warsaw, yeah.
employers in the software in Warsaw. And yeah,
Thank you so much for coming.
Yeah,
Thanks
no,
for
you're
having
welcome.
us.
Thanks for having us.
thank you everyone, and see you in next episode.
Bye.
Bye.